All right, so we have the three syntheses of the unconscious that we just outlined. Hopefully, we'll be able to link that to this video. And so, in chapter 2, Deleuze and Guattari develop 5 paralogisms, and they're drawing the term paralogism from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and the paralogisms apply to in the Critique of Pure Reason. The paralogisms apply to the domain of psychology, and in particular, what's called rational psychology, which is reasoning about the nature of the soul and the self. And there's a long story here, and we can't get into all the bells and whistles in Kant, but it does help us to orient what's going on here. In the Critique of Pure Reason, paralogism is an error in reasoning that arises by virtue of the form of reasoning. There is an illegitimate form of reasoning, not content of reasoning, at work in the 4 paralogisms that Kant outlines in the Critique of Pure Reason. And so what's going on here in the transcendental deduction of the Critique of Pure Reason? Kant said that there has to be a transcendental subject, an I think, that accompanies all of our representations. And what's interesting about Kant's transcendental subject, this transcendental unity of apperception, or this I think, is that it is completely empty, right? So it's very different than the psychological self or the stream of consciousness that David Hume talks about. It is a pure form that experiences that accompanies all of our experiences or our representations. And so for those of you who have read Hume's treatise on the human understanding, as well as his inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume says that, look, when I introspect, I don't find anything like a substantial self or a subject. I just find ever-shifting trains of thought, impressions, sensations, as well as memories popping up. I don't find this sort of substantial self that, for example, Descartes talked about in the Meditations. Kant's rejoinder to this is more or less that with respect to the empirical concept of my inner sense, my internal experience, Hume is right, but nonetheless, accompanying all these experiences as that which unifies these experiences is this purely formal and empty I think. And it has a structure that is somewhat akin to a mathematical function. In fact, I think, if I remember the deduction correctly, Kant even draws this comparison. It's like a sort of f of x, right, where you can plug in the impressions or sensations that you're having at that time and get a particular result or outcome. So this I think is not the same thing as the empirical ego, our sense of self. And what's going on in the paralogisms or rational psychology is that the rational psychologist, like Descartes, is treating the I think as if it is a thing or a substance that we can immediately predicate the categories of. In order to deduce that, for example, that the self is immortal or that it's always self-identical. And as Kant famously said, right, experience is the unity of intuition or sensation and the categories of the understanding. What the rational psychologist is cutting out of the picture is that dimension of intuition, and this is what makes it illicit. And so in Deleuze and Guattari, the paralogisms are something slightly different. He says, or they say, that there is a legitimate use of the, and Michael here was kind enough to do an excellent write-up on the course homepage about the 5 paralogisms, drawing on Eugene Holland, who, by the way, I mean, was it just me, Michael, or does Eugene Holland have them out of order?
Yeah, and you know what's strange? I ran into a couple issues. So I used Holland and Buchanan as my supplementary material, and not only do they have them in different orders, the fifth one they say is totally different. They don't even say that. Yeah, so for Holland says the fifth one is the afterword or the paralogism of the afterword, and Buchanan says it's the paralogism of desiring production. So I don't know what we make of that. If there's six paralogisms, because I always hear there's five, but they don't. They get four in common and then disagree on the fifth one. And yeah, I mean, I don't know why Holland, kind of took them out of order. It was kind of strange.
Yeah, I mean, he puts the fourth paralogism first, the paralogism of displacement of
Yeah.
desire, when the first paralogism is about the phallus and the
Hmm.
transition from part objects to a global whole object. And so it's very strange the way he orders them. We might be able to get some agreement between Holland and Buchanan on the paralogism of what he is calling the afterword. We'll see whether or not we're successful. That fifth paralogism is introduced very briefly, and when they talk about a final paralogism, they're not very clear on what it is because they're talking about the legitimate use of the synthesis rather than the illegitimate. And so I take it that the proceeding in that chapter, I can't remember if it's the chapter on social repression. I think it is. Is that right, or is it neurosis versus
Not
psychosis? It's one or the
sure.
other. Um, but I would take it that the proceeding is going to outline the illegitimate use, and so we have an imminent use, and this is key in Kant, right? The categories of the understanding can only legitimately be used imminently to reason. That is, with respect, they always have to be synthesized with experience or intuition in some way or another in Kant. Well, when we talk about an imminent use of the syntheses in Deleuze and Guattari, I think what we're talking about is in terms of the internal functioning of the unconscious. What is the logic of the unconscious itself? And I'll try and outline a little bit what that might mean in a moment. And then we have the illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious, and it's the same in Kant, although those categories aren't unconscious. In the illegitimate use, the syntheses are used in a transcendent fashion. They refer to some sort of global object or term that is not found in the functioning of the unconscious. And there is, and I'm hoping that we'll get answers to this in Chapter 3, because it is not at all clear to me, going on based on their arguments, how a transcendent or illegitimate use of the syntheses is possible. They need some sort of story to tell here, and we can be sympathetic to what it is that they're arguing and what it is that they're trying to develop. That's fine, but they need to, as we say in mathematics, they need to show their work. And so how the fuck are we getting a transcendent use of these syntheses if this is just the way the unconscious functions as outlined in the first chapter? And this is an incredibly serious problem for them. I think that their ability to answer this question, the entire project of Anti-Oedipus is dependent upon their ability to answer this sort of question. And what is it that makes it so mysterious? All right, we are told again and again and again about the unconscious that it is connective, that it's disjunctive, that it is conjunctive. Desire should not fall into these traps if what it is that they're saying is true. And so we get to the end of, how many sections are there in, and I find it really maddening. And I'm just a pain in the ass this way. We get to chapter, or section 7 of chapter 2, and we are told that the transcendent use of the syntheses arises from social repression. right? So they want to, this is where they're following Reich, and admittedly, I've never read Reich. Maybe I should at some point, but all that Oregon stuff anyway. They want to make the claim that it is social repression that is leading to this illegitimate use of the syntheses that gives rise to all of these paralogisms. Well, what is the problem that we're encountering here? If the unconscious functions in the way that they've outlined, then that means that society is going to be a product of this desiring production, which means that society should not be able to serve this repressive function that they're trying to make it do. I mean, do you guys see the nature of the problem here? Or, I mean, it seems like we're getting some sort of magical thing that's going on here where the Oedipus is being applied by society in some way to the individual desiring subjects or whatever we want to call them, right? But that society is going to be a product of all of those desiring machines. How is it possible for this to take place? We need some sort of story. And my hypothesis is going to be that we find the answer to these questions in Chapter 3 somehow with these different orders. But it's still very unclear to me how this is taking place. Now, in before we started the new classroom here, in chapter I said that a lot of what's going on with Deleuze and Guattari here can be read as Freud versus Freud. And so we have the early version of Freud before the Oedipus complex comes to dominate everything, that is focused on the dynamics of the unconscious. If you have access to, and I'm not sure if it's published in a standalone version. Hold on and give me a minute here. Mo's freaking out. All right. And so what was I saying? We have the early version. If you have the opportunity, I'm not sure if there's a standalone version published. You might be able to find it online. But there's an incredibly important essay that was never published during his lifetime called the Project Essay for Scientific Psychology. It's called Project for Scientific Psychology. There's a date of 18-something for that essay. And this is where, based on his early work in neurology, and unfortunately I don't have it here on my bookcase, he's developing the dynamics of the unconscious, and there is no Oedipus in this early version. The unconscious is conceived of in ways that are very, very similar to the way in which Deleuze and Guattari talk about these three syntheses, where we have these what Freud calls cathexes and anti-cathexes, ways in which different what would you even call them? Thoughts are libidinally related to one another and blocked off from one another. It's all about gradients of intensity, the way the unconscious functions in this earlier point. And so pain leads to an anti-cathexes. The pushing away of this idea of experience. Pleasure leads to a cathexes, a connective synthesis that's taking place here. And the way in which the formations of the unconscious are being conceived are in terms of painful and traumatic experiences that the unconscious tries to push out of the system through an anti-cathexis, but these experiences still produce effects through what might be called sideways or lateral or transversal connections among the neuronal system that come back in the form of symptoms, right? Classical Freud. And then later on, by the time that we get the ego in the id, this short. Did you find it online?
Yeah, that's I think that's a PDF of it. Yeah.
Good. Later on, by the time we get to the ego and the id, Now we have the whole Oedipus complex and the drama that the infant has to go through over the course of its development. And the unconscious becomes a theater where, you know, as we say, all roads lead to Rome. They're all being traced back to this Oedipus complex that the infant desires the mother, and the father comes in as prohibition, and it has the murderous thoughts towards the father and everything like that. And then it has to internalize the Oedipus in some way to get past this phase and displace its desire onto something else in order to function well. Now, in Freud's essay in the metapsychological writings, Freud outlined some things about the nature of the unconscious in that essay, and I forget the exact title of it. He outlined some things in that essay on the unconscious that, if you're familiar with Freudian theory and the Oedipus complex, as well as Lacanian theory in particular, should make your ears perk up, right? You know, something is going on here that shouldn't be possible. And so what is it that Freud tells us in that essay? He tells us that the unconscious knows no contradictions. This is a crucial thing. There is no possibility of contradiction. Who did we lose? There's no possibility of contradiction in the unconscious as Freud. It can take the most disparate contradictory ideas and put them together in a way that works for the unconscious. And so why is this so important? Because when we think about the Oedipus complex as it functions, it's all about a certain sort of contradiction at work in the unconscious. Yet here we're being told, no, there can't be any contradictions in the unconscious. More importantly, what is it that Freud tells us? Freud tells us that the unconscious knows nothing of negation. And I mean, let that sink in for a moment, the claim that the unconscious knows nothing of negation. All of the Oedipus complex, as well as you know, Lacan's framework of alienation and separation, the developmental process that the infant goes through in order to become a subject, is based on lack or negation. Yet we're told that the unconscious knows nothing of lack or negation. It's just not operative in the unconscious. So something is amiss here, right? How is it that we can get these dynamics of the you know, the famous child playing his Fort Dog game, which Freud says is you know, reenacting the presence and absence, the lack of its mother, and bringing it back again, if the unconscious knows nothing of lack or negation. And finally, we're told that the formations of the unconscious, the traces that are there in the unconscious, are eternal. They are timeless. And so in Civilization and Its Discontents, he gives this wonderful image of the Roman city, and you know, he claims, look, if you want to think about what the unconscious is like, think about the Roman city at all different points in its history. Right, so its original founding, when it's just a little village, and then later on when it you know, becomes the great capital of Rome with all the architecture. Did somebody say something? Present day Rome. All of these things are simultaneously there in the Freudian unconscious, enacting, right, the events that took place there for all eternity without any of them ever passing. And so, and you know, from a certain vantage and from a certain perspective, Deleuze and Guattari are very rigorously following this characterization of the unconscious as being affirmative or positive, without contradiction, without negation, without lack in any sort of way. And they are saying, look, this is the way the unconscious immanently functions. It doesn't cathect or connect to global or full persons. It only relates to partial flows these famous part objects that they're talking about. It doesn't have any negation or lack within it. It doesn't have any fixed identity, this idea of being without contradiction. And so when you have a dream, you can very much be like the schizophrenic, where you're simultaneously Napoleon and Britney Spears and Socrates at the same time. You're all the names of history without there being any sort of contradiction. You can simultaneously be man and woman, or dog and human, wolf and human, and all these sorts of things. They're very rigorously carrying this out. When we get to Lacan, they are incredibly consistent in praising Lacan for the discovery of the objet these objects that aren't really objects around which the drive circulates. And if you follow the development of Lacan on the concept of the objet, he's carrying out a polemic against Anna Freud's psychoanalysis, which had become the dominant form of psychoanalysis with the International Psychoanalytic Association, what was called ego psychology, which was all about strengthening the ego. And he thought that this idea of strengthening the ego was madness. This is the domain of the imaginary, which leads to all sorts of conflictual relationships with others, rivalry, and so on and so forth. But one of the things, and I've never fully followed out this debate, one of the things that the ego psychologists were arguing was that you would reach the end of analysis and be a quote-unquote healthy subject when all of your drives, and so what Freud describes in the 3 essays on sexuality, these different stages of the drive that were organized around the oral drive, the anal drive, and so on, that play a key role in perversion, when all of your drives are organized around genital sexuality, genital heterosexuality. And so I guess what they were calling this at the time was oblative love, right? It's a unified, integrated subject that is capable of this sort of oblative, giving love. And part of what makes Lacan's teaching so controversial within this context is that the objets can't be unified. They trace gaze, breast, voice, as well as the feces or the anal drive. They can't be unified around an ego or underneath the phallus. The drives trace their own course in this sort of haphazard way that can never bring about unity. Within the subject. And so here, with the objet, which Deleuze and Guattari themselves equate with their desiring machines, we have a sort of enjoyment or desire that evades all of these transcendent uses of the syntheses. And I've seen these drives at work firsthand within the clinical setting with patients and so on and so forth. And it's quite striking and disturbing to see how the objets function in the life of a person in this sort of subterranean or this unconscious form. All right, so before we move on, I don't know if maybe we need to take a break before we move on and to go through the 5 syntheses. But do we have any remarks or comments at this point?
So just my understanding of the difference between the classical Freud and the Oedipus-centric Freud
Thank you, and this is DriveWire for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Today, we learned that Hyundai is in talks with Google about a
That
future partnership related to in-car
Freud, the reaction against his notion that childhood sexual trauma was majorly responsible for all of the mental, I mean, not all of the mental illness, but a significant amount of the symptoms that he was treating. God damn it.
You have a television on in the background, or?
No, my computer is just totally filled with viruses.
Oh, great.
And so the backlash was so great against him that he invents the Oedipus complex to sort of as a workaround.
Unlike competitors like
so that he could maintain the same, virtually the same theory, but with this structure. And then I had also read somewhere else that Freud used the Oedipus complex also to shock patients into resisting him, and that he didn't assume it was always the case for the people he was treating. That it was partially to make them react.
Today, we learned that Hyundai
something like that.
Google about a future partnership related to in-car technology, mobile connectivity.
I'm sorry about all.
Unlike competitors.
All right, so I don't think that's quite accurate. You know, the early Freud is indeed based on the trauma theory of neurosis, and so the idea is that the young child in their experience undergoes some sort of trauma. Often it was of a a sexual nature, that they were molested or something along these lines, and that this idea gets repressed. And the old aphorism is, the rule is, with every repression there is a return of the repressed. It comes back in the form of symptoms. And Freud allows the possibility later on in his work with his patients that sometimes this is in fact the case, right? But what Freud increasingly found in his practice was that he was encountering patients that they were in the process of free association. They were recollecting events and experiences that couldn't possibly have happened, right? I mean, the people just weren't there, or they were already dead, or something like that. And so they were having memories of experiences that didn't take place. And so at this point, Freud moves away from the trauma theory of neurosis, and and moving away from the trauma theory of neurosis, it doesn't mean he abandoned it altogether. Of course, there are people that at a very young age were molested or were raped, by other people, and so on and so forth. It just means that the theory had to be modified, and so he moves from the trauma theory to a theory of fantasy, where it is some sort of fantasy at work that is producing these sorts of experiences later on in life. And so, I think an example of this would be the Wolfman, who there is some debate as to whether or not the Wolfman was an obsessional, which, if memory serves me right, Freud classified him as obsessional. Lacan strongly suggests that he actually belongs to the category of psychosis as far as subject structures go. But at the root of the Wolfman's neurosis or psychosis, whichever it is, was this primordial experience of seeing his parents have sex at Terrago, right? From behind, and this memory was repressed, and it led to all of these subsequent symptoms in his unconscious structure. And so for Freud, it doesn't really matter. Did he really witness an event like this? Did he not witness an event like this? It doesn't matter, right? With respect to Freud, subsequent Freud suggests that a great deal of neurosis revolved around the castration complex, and the question here: did the kid, as they developed, did they actually have to be threatened with castration by their mother or their father at some point in time, or is it just a fantasized possibility of castration? From the standpoint of the unconscious, it doesn't matter. The unconscious, and this is an additional characteristic of the unconscious doesn't make any distinction between what is fantasized and what is real. They're both equally real from the standpoint of the unconscious. And so I don't know that I would describe the Oedipus complex as a workaround on Freud's part.
Well, maybe not entirely, but like the reaction against the trauma theory was so amongst both the sort of society as well as his colleagues was so, and then I'm sorry, I can't remember right now where I read it. It's because of the incidence rate of incest in Victorian era society was profound, similar to our own age, and just, I mean, not that it's a complete workaround, but like a way to, theorize it without directly linking it to actual sexual molestation. They sort of fantasize, they desire it, as opposed to it actually occurring. Something like that.
And I mean, there's a huge debate about this, right? And so a couple of decades ago, I don't know if you remember or not, Thomas. And I forget who the author is now. There was a man who, a therapist who wrote a book on Freud's studies, Freud and Breuer's studies over hysteria, and he argued that Freud systematically later on repressed the trauma theory of neurosis. He systematically did this for Victorian patriarchal reasons. I think this is what you're alluding to. And in the 80s and in the 90s, out of this sort of debate, and this was tilted towards feminism and everything like that. So Freud, the big bad patriarch, right, repressing these abuses of women that took place and everything. There was a
huge tradition of that, right? Like so much.
What's that?
There was just a huge tradition of that stuff, right? The feminist critique of Freud from that direction, like that was a whole cottage industry throughout the 80s and 90s, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that was outside of the academy. It was in psychotherapeutic circles, and there was a huge explosion of diagnoses that took place, especially in the United States. I'm not sure if it spilled over to Europe, but and South America and Central America, but in Canada. But there was a huge explosion of diagnoses, on the one hand, of repressed memory syndrome, and on the other hand, multiple personality disorder. Right, and so the new name for hysteria was multiple personality disorder, and what you were having predominantly women, but also men as well. They were going to see therapists, and they were suffering from problems like alcoholism, or heavy drinking, and problems in their relationship, all sorts of things. And based on this book and the theorization that came out of it, there was a very quick move to diagnose the woman as, or the person as, suffering from multiple personality disorder, and multiple personality disorder as being the result of a childhood trauma where they had been molested. And no doubt there are cases in which this took place, but and it was almost a sort of fashionable diagnosis at the time. And if you looked at the sort of progression of, and I hope all of you aren't being bored by this. These are important things, though. But if you look at the way in which the therapies were carried out in the clinic with these people, there was a whole lot of suggestion. There was almost a sort of grooming of the patients that took place, where they were encouraged to name different dimensions of their personality and everything like that, rather than the patient of their own accord remembering something like some sort of childhood experience where an older kid had, raped them or something like that. It was instead, suggested, did your aunt ever touch you in an inappropriate way? The analyst was actually asking these questions, highly leading questions, rather than allowing the material to emerge of its own accord, which is the way it's supposed to happen in an analysis. Well, Adam, I don't think we want to make that argument. We have to go with what we find in the clinic, and so we can't jump to judgments. We have to go with the speech of what people actually say.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, people say things in the clinic, and that's what came to their mind. Now, of course, they can be subject to discourses and everything like that they've been interpolated into, but we do have to take that clinical material, I think, seriously.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
And there were a lot of cases where men were diagnosed with multiple personality disorder as well, based on these sorts of trauma theories. But when you looked at the evolution, and it very much was a fad. I can't remember if it was in the late 80s or it was the early 90s. When you look at the evolution of these diagnoses, international or national organizations were formed, right, based on repressed memory therapy and multiple personality disorder. And the theories of seduction were getting more and more outlandish over time. And so these organizations became convinced, and I kid you not, right, they became convinced that there were cults of Satanists, I'm not making this up, across the entire country, where
incredible. I've been making a study of the Satanic Panic for a while. It's just an amazing phenomenon.
It was unbelievable, and people were going into these sessions, and they were remembering satanic rituals where there were orgies with all the family members, and where babies were being sacrificed, and where aunts and uncles and people were being killed, and they were being forced to do unspeakable things. These memories were coming back, and how did you describe it? The satanic paranoia, or
it was I've been collecting these texts by pastors from the late 80s and early 90s, that warn of the evils of these things, and just spread terrible rumors to terrorize these Christian parents of the time. They said that some police lieutenants said 90% of child abductions are related to satanic activity, and that Satanists have these movable crematorium that they burn their victims alive in, and that there's no traces of them, and hysteria. Yeah.
And I mean, patients were remembering these things. They were actually remembering these things. Sometimes it was partially as a result of suggestion on the part of their therapist, right? Do you ever remember something like this taking place? And people that were remembering these memories, they were taking family members to court in certain cases. Parents were sent to prison as a result of this. They were disowning family members, and there were a few cases, I believe, where is shown the sort of systematic therapeutic abuse that was taking place here. and that some of these things were just impossible. The people weren't in these places when it was being remembered, or it just couldn't have taken place. And there was a lot of discussion, along these lines of police interrogations and being able to actually produce a memory inside of a person. And this tended in the direction of the fantasy theory of neurosis, rather than the trauma theory of neurosis, where, of course, people were actually remembering these sorts of things. They were having these memories, right? The question is, right, were they witness? And I kid you, I know it sounds so strange and outlandish to talk about these things, but were entire family members having these orgies and sacrificing babies in front of the kids and all this sort of stuff, or is that some sort of unconscious fantasy that is that's taking place here? And Freud, he was in fact finding, we can make the case. It's hard to make these periodizations as I'm trying to make them. If we look at studies over of hysteria with Breuer, one of the things that you find again and again with the women that they were treating is that the men in these women's lives, whether it be the father or the husband, had fallen ill, and they were going through prolonged periods of having to care for them. And so, in the case of Elizabeth von R, right, she. Her entire life for a period was occupied in caring for her sick father, and it does seem that a lot of their symptomology was Oedipal in nature, about this relationship to the men in their life in some form or another. And so in Deleuze-Guattari, they're quite clear in this book, right? It's easy early on, especially in the first chapter, to think of the Oedipus as something that the psychoanalyst is imposing upon the patient, and or the analysand, and that's there is some truth to that, right? Well, part of their critique is that there are a lot of lazy psychoanalysts out there that whenever the patient is talking about the boss or their husband or a particular woman or something like that, they immediately jump to, well, that's your father, or that's your mother, or that's your sister. This is what's meant by the unconscious as a theater, that all roads lead back to the Oedipus as this sort of explanatory framework in which to comprehend the symptoms of the patient. But as Michael here is quoting in the sidebar, but right, they're quite clear that psychoanalysts did not invent the Oedipus. They say, look, the patients come into the clinic and they're Oedipalized. They're thinking about these things in terms of family dynamics. Their minds are going to these sorts of family dynamics. The Oedipus is a real conflict that people suffer from. And so maybe one of the ways to think about this is, in light of the three syntheses of the unconscious that we've outlined, as well as the way in which Freud describes the unconscious, as I've outlined, and the way in which Lacan describes the objet, we know that the Oedipus can't be unconscious. It has to be, some sort of structure of the preconscious or even of the conscious mind, the way in which the ego thinks about the world. And so on the one hand, we have the unconscious, and Freud is quite clear at certain points. He says, look, if you want to know what the unconscious is like, go to the schizophrenic. In the schizophrenic, all of the mechanisms of the unconscious are right there on the surface rather than repressed. That's how it works. That's what it looks like. And so on the one hand, we have the schizophrenic unconscious governed by these three eminent uses of the syntheses. And then, on the other hand, we have this conscious structure of the Oedipus that is in conflict with the way in which these unconscious syntheses function. Right? And so we have these two distinct domains that are pushing in different directions. And so I want to take a break here, and when we come back, I want to talk, because a lot of this is remaining abstract at this point. When we come back, I want to talk about the 5 paralogisms and see what sense we can make of them. Before we take a 10 or 15-minute break, does anybody have any questions or remarks that they want to make? Yeah, look up repressed memory therapy and Satanism and see what comes up. This was, I know I sound like a lunatic talking about this, but this was something that really took place in the United States. It was amazing.
Just to throw a little supplement out, so my aunt was a chaplain, and she was a devout Baptist, and growing up, she had all the little pamphlets about, you know, heavy metal music and Satanism and all of that. And so, no, I mean, since I was a kid, I know, you know, especially in the 80s, you know, into the early 90s, it was a real deep fear that, you know, certain people had, that somehow, you know, if you start listening to, you know, Metallica or whatever, you're going to end up
playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, exactly.
All the fear, like all of us were going to go into the sewers and
Yep.
you know, become Satanists. And you laughed, Ted. I mean,
I don't know what the fear was of Satanism in the 80s, but I mean, it was radical. My aunt used to pass out all these pamphlets to, you know, warn people about the threat of Satanism and all that. And
I don't think it was even strictly a Christian or an evangelical thing. I mean, it was a, you know, a panic even outside of the circles. I mean, these,
right.
You know, this association, this repressed memory, multiple personality disorder association, was taking seriously. You know, they weren't a Christian organization, taking seriously that there was this rash of Satanists out there that were molesting kids, and you know, molestation, something that definitely takes place, but yeah, this was on steroids. Yeah. All right, so let's take 10, come back at 10 after, and we'll jump into the paralogisms. So we're missing Michael and Thomas.
I sent a message in the Facebook.
Yeah, I saw that, and we'll get to that in a second.
Great.
And first, I want to apologize to Adam here for jumping all over you about that. I think I see what you were getting at with your remark earlier.
Makes a little more sense now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about the particular clinical setting you were describing. I was more thinking about the general kind of media and cultural dissemination of dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder as sort of a distinctly feminine thing, and sort of in contrast to sort of kind of the unified phallic, like the man who's like all one, totally unified self.
Yeah. All right, so let's begin with the question that Ted asks here about what exactly the problem is that I see, and it could be that I'm working with an inadequate model of the nature of society, and so we can situate this issue as a problem of mereology. In logic and ontology, mereology is the study of the relationship between parts and wholes, their logical structure. How do parts relate to the wholes to which they belong? How are wholes composed of their parts? And so if we think about society in mereological terms, of course, any society is going to be composed of the parts that make it up, and that's going to be organic beings, right? And so while a society is definitely going to be more than the sum of its parts that make it up, it's nonetheless going to be supervenient upon those, and it's such dangerous language in Deleuze and Guattari, those individuals or those persons that compose society. And so the issue that I'm finding here is that the unconscious, as both Freud describes it against his better judgment, and certainly as Deleuze and Guattari describe it, is radically anti-Oedipal. And as we go through the different paralogisms, we'll see this in greater detail. But it is not Oedipal in any way. It's it's without contradiction, it's without negation, without lack. Desire circulates not around global persons, the total person like the father or the mother, but around these partial flows. And so a good example of this is the way the infant relates to the breast. Right? The flow of milk is a partial object that's being drawn from that breast, and that partial object isn't associated with a mother. The unconscious is just connecting to this flow and nothing more. Right? It's a key point to get about the connective synthesis. And all of the partial objects, they don't form a unity, right? And so, like the loving gaze of the mother as the infant drinks the milk, well, that gaze, these flows of color or light, are one partial object that is disconnected from the flow of milk, that is disconnected from another flow, and so on and so forth. These things don't unify. They're flying in all sorts of different directions without any sort of global unification. And so we get this very mysterious question here. If this is the way the unconscious works, and if society is supervenient on these syntheses as well, how do we ever get a situation where something global and transcendent emerges out of these radically anti-Oedipal, schizophrenic processes of the unconscious? It's difficult to see how that will take place, how it can even come into being. And so, as I see it, we need some sort of story. If we want to make the claim that psychic repression doesn't come first, but it is a product of social repression, we need some sort of story as to how this sort of Oedipalizing social repression can even come into existence within this sort of framework. Right? And so that's the sort of issue that I'm raising here. Why isn't society inherently schizophrenic? I guess would be the question. And so, just a quick note about vocabulary here. We have 3 terms that are important to keep in mind with respect to the paralogisms. First, we have the immanent use of the syntheses. That's just the functioning of the unconscious as such from the standpoint of the unconscious. We have the term transcendent, right? And the transcendent is the introduction of any sort of full or complete term into the immanent function of this unconscious. And so there's a sort of slippage here that takes place where the unconscious is relating simply to these part objects as such. All right, the slippage that takes place is those part objects come to be conceived of a part of a global person in their entirety, but that's not the way the unconscious functions. And then finally we have a third term that they don't talk about a whole lot, but it's important to keep in mind, the transcendental. And in my experience, this was something that I encountered years ago when I was writing Difference and Givenness. Unfortunately, Deleuze's rhetoric gets away from them, and people have a tendency to demonize certain philosophers. And because they in particular, Kant and Hegel are the 2 big bad guys, they never bother to sit down and read these actual thinkers. Freud would be another one as well within this context. Lacan would be another one. And so they never learn what those thinkers are in fact arguing and how they're using this terminology, and they gloss over the positive moments where Deleuze is drawing on these thinkers in a variety of ways. And so there's a lot of confusion among people I found between the transcendental and the transcendent. The transcendent is a bad term in Kant as well. If you read the Transcendental Dialectic, the problem always in the Transcendental Dialectic is that the mind or reason is applying the categories in a transcendent fashion, independent of the conditions for the possibility of experience, and this is what gets it into all of these problems with the paralogisms and the antinomies of reason. The transcendental, and it's unfortunate that Kant chose this term, the transcendental refers actually to the immanent. It is structures of mind that are conditions for the possibility of experience. And so when we talk about experience in Deleuze and Guattari, if we wanted to talk about the transcendental, the 3 syntheses are the transcendental. The question is how to use them immanently rather than in a transcendent fashion. And so, what I want to suggest is be careful to carefully distinguish, rigorously distinguish the term transcendent from transcendental. They have 2 entirely different meanings in this framework, and the transcendental falls on the side of the immanent, not the transcendent. And so, to go through these paralogisms very quickly, the first paralogism that we have is the paralogism of extrapolation. And so, as I was just mentioning a moment ago, in its proper or immanent usage, the connective synthesis is a synthesis that relates solely to partial objects, flows that are cut off by these desiring machines that have no meaning or signification. They're defined in terms of what they do, not what they might signify. And as Freud says in the 3 essays on sexuality, all of us are polymorphously perverse in our infancy, and the drives Lacan seems to concur with this, over the course of our entire life are polymorphously perverse. And what that amounts to saying is, following on what Adam was saying before the break, is that there is no natural sexuality right, that we can speak of that would be heteronormative or anything along these lines, drive gratification can be found from any source. And so, for example, the oral drive is indifferent to whether or not it is a cigarette or a thumb or a nipple or any other food, lack of food. Any number of things can satisfy this drive satisfaction, and it's indifferent to gender identity as well in its imminent usage. It can find this satisfaction wherever. In its transcendent usage, Deleuze and Guattari say there is a passage from the part objects to a global object. They say the phallus that then functions to both relate the two sexes to one another as well as distinguish the two sexes from one another. And what takes place here, this is all based on, and so where exactly does the fallacy lie here? I mean, let's first discuss that. What's the transcendent usage that's at work in the?
Is it the fallacy of if there's parts, therefore they have to ultimately be rooted in a whole, and so the whole has the primacy, and not the parts?
Yeah, and so I guess and it's very difficult, to know how to put it. I guess what's going on here is the part object isn't really a distinct object, right? It's like the infant doesn't know whether the breast is something separate from it or whether it is the breast, right? It's this partial flow. There's this sort of indiscernibility. What takes place in the transcendent, illegitimate use of the connective synthesis is the part, in this case the phallus, is turned into a full object. And as Lacan puts it, on the male side of the equation, the male has the phallus. On the female side of the equation, and for me, the concept of phallus is always murky. Maybe I shouldn't admit that in public, but since we've already talked about satanic, fears, why not go full bore and just destroy my career? But the woman is the phallus. And so what happens here is there is a presupposition of, Deleuze and Guattari say, a global full ego or self that is unified and structured from the standpoint of the three syntheses. We already saw that there is no unified self like this, that's an illusion. There's a presupposition of a global unified self that then becomes lack as a result of this extrapolation of the phallus. And so the way in which on the masculine side of the equation this lack is introduced through the phallus is that we become subject to castration, the possibility of castration. And I think the way that Lacan would put it, once this has taken place, this transcendent use of the synthesis, we are always already castrated, even while we have the phallus, because it functions as a signifier. And then on the feminine side of the equation, it is since the woman is without the phallus, right? She is encountered as always already lacking. But we already saw in these three, what is the fallacy here that's at work in this first paralogism of the connective synthesis. We already saw that from the standpoint of the three syntheses, there is no lack, nor are there any sort of global subjects, and so this is what it is that makes, right, the first paralogism a fallacy or a paralogism. And of course, we're going to have some sort of question or some sort of theory, and I presume this is the work that the theory of the socius is going to be doing, as to how this extrapolation takes place. How can we come to think about ourselves in these sort of terms? Any comments on that first paralogism?
Yeah, I guess the trickiest part of that one for me was understanding exactly how they think the phallus does this. You know, I mean, from what I've read, of Lacan's theory of the Oedipus complex, it's somehow this idea that what the phallus is just, the baby, wants the mother all to itself. The mother gets distracted by other things, and so the baby gets some idea that there's this thing that she desires that takes her away from the baby. And I guess you could say in that moment there is kind of some kind of proto full image of yourself. I lack something, she wants something from somebody else, and then you end up identifying the thing that she lacks with, the name of the father, which in some weird way I take it that the phallus ends up being the name of the father in some way, because it's the very lack that, bars the subject, but how, they're claiming it creates the sense of wholeness of persons, I wasn't able to follow exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just an incredibly murky concept, and psychoanalytic theorists are all over the place. I keep hoping I find this golden book that clearly explains all these things, rather than just throwing this terminology around as if it's self-evident. Because like the way you're discussing it is the way I always take the concept of the phallus, right? The infant begins by thinking that it is the phallus.
Yeah.
In the sense that, how is it that Lacan describes the phallus, hopefully I get the phrasing just right, as the signifier of the other's desire, right?
Yeah.
And so it takes itself to be the sole object of maternal desire. And then the infant, this is where we begin to get the sort of Fort Daw game, then the infant begins to notice that the mother's desire seems to... Daniel, maybe you could turn on your camera. It seems to its desire, her desire seems to be elsewhere, or it could be the father that is the primary caregiver, and his desire seems to be elsewhere.
Right, it could be his job that's the actual symbolic father. Like, if you're a single dad, you take care of your baby, but you have a job, and that job is always separating you from your kid, so your job's the name of the father. And to me, what he's doing with the Oedipus complex is very interesting and insightful, but the terms phallus and name of the father give it a really kind of abstract quality to it, when what I think Lacan was doing was very interesting and very concrete.
Yeah. And so, right, the infant notices that the primary caregiver, whether it's male or female, that her desire lies elsewhere, that the infant isn't the sole object of interest for the caregiver. Maybe she's a lesbian, right, and it could be the other partner in that relationship. Maybe the father is a primary caregiver. But there were heated debates years ago on the Lacan list that I used to participate in quite a bit as to whether or not same-sex couples, these dynamics could take place, which was madness and lunacy, right? If you take a Lacanian approach where all these structures are symbolic, not based on the imaginary or the way things look. And so... The key point is the desire lies elsewhere, and then there is this drama that takes place where the infant identifies with this other desire in order to try and capture the maternal desire again in some way or another. And so
I was getting the idea that somehow when it realizes it's not the phallus, or it's not the thing that just completely satisfies the primary caregiver's desire, there's a kind of sense of whole personality or selfhood. Again, I don't know how to reconcile that, because Lacan says that comes from the mirror stage, but on some level it seems like the experience of the desire of the other in the Oedipus complex gives the baby a sense of wholeness, and somehow the lack of the phallus is where it gets the whole person idea from.
Yeah, I mean, the question is always, in the case of neurosis, what am I for the other? And so that question is organized around finding the lack in the other. This is the process. So first there's the alienation that takes place, right? The infant is born. Even before it's born, there's a system of language and signifiers, this discourse that's woven around it that it's alienated in. It has to express itself through language, and it can never do that perfectly. And so the infant's crying, and the parents bring it the pink elephant rather than the bottle that it wants. It's already alienated in the desire of the other. And then there's this moment of separation where the infant begins to discover the lack and the absences in the other, and it forms itself in terms of that lack as an answer to the desire of the other. And so that's where we begin to get something like the beginning of a substantial self or ego that is being being formed here. And the mirror phase is like later on in Seminar 9, Identification. Lacan's earliest work is almost entirely organized around the mirror phase and the sort of things that Kojève developed in terms of Hegel and the way the ego has these master-slave struggles and everything like that, and how the imaginary is organized around aggressivity and all that stuff for that reason. It can only be mine or yours, Michael. It can't be ours, right? You must die. And if you're too much like me, I want to kill you because somehow that's usurping my ego in the imaginary. But later on in things like Seminar 9, he's trying to work this together with the symbolic dimension of alienation and separation that will culminate in Seminars 11 and 12 and so on, where he's working this all out. Right, so
that's where he ends up bringing in, like I think I read where the early Lacan thinks that there's a kind of internal dialectic to the imaginary, that the imaginary realm develops on its own, but later on he realizes that the parents are there and they have what's the term, the unary trait, some term that gets attached to the image, and so there's this whole symbolic function, and so that's where he bridges into the symbolic, and then he later on he progresses into the relation between the symbolic and the real. But it was that real step in seeing that even the mere stage itself has this symbolic dimension.
Right, and so it's the thing is, when you read the actual psychoanalytic literature and they talk about the phallus, there are a couple of problems here, right? A lot of times you'll just see endlessly the phallus sliding into the penis, and it's just not clear from this Lacanian account why this would have anything to do with the penis. And the idea that the infant, the young infant, as it's trying to understand why am I not the sole object of Mummy's desire, is thinking that it's dad's penis. I mean, like, why would the kid even think that?
That's
right?
madness to me. It's like kids are not thinking that. They don't. I mean, yeah, I'm with you, and I think the term phallus just somehow naturally has this kind of semiotic gravity towards penis that really gets in the way of understanding what Lacan was trying to do with the concept.
Yeah, maybe, but then later on, right, when we're getting to Seminars, 18, I think it starts, up through 20, where he's developing sexuation, now we see the reappearance of the phallus and those equations for the graphs of sexuation. And we're wondering to ourselves, why is one side of this graph called masculine and the other side of this graph called feminine? Because it doesn't seem like these things would map on to sexed bodies in any sort of way, right? Like you could be a woman in terms of your structure of desire and how you deal with the deadlocks and everything like that. But we still see psychoanalytic theorists, right, again, pushing in these sorts of directions. And so there's that whole issue here. But, I mean, for our purposes, it's enough that the phallus as the signifier of desire becomes that point. We could think of it as an accretion point where an ego begins to form itself as a unified self. And the argument here, just like we were talking about with the 3 essays on sexuality and polymorphous perversity, is that the unconscious doesn't have any knowledge of unified objects in these sorts of ways, right? And it's just not populated by those sorts of identities. And so that's the first paralogism, this extraction of global unities that are substantial objects in their own right, such as the phallus, such as the ego, that are transcendent to these dynamics of the unconscious. The second paralogism is the double bind, the paralogism of the double bind. And the paralogism of the double bind, what is it that it applies to? The disjunctive synthesis. And so Deleuze and Guattari say that on the body without organs, where we have all these disjunctive terms such as male and female, father and mother, all of the names of history, in its immanent usage, the disjunctive synthesis functions in an inclusive fashion. It's not an either or, it is a both and although I don't think they use that terminology. But the idea here seems to be that, as we were talking about before the break with the schizophrenic, they, in the immanent usage of the disjunctive synthesis, they experience themselves as being man and woman, right? So Schreber is both man and woman, not at the same time, but it's not a sort of either or. We looked at the truth table before, where we saw that a disjunctive statement in its non-exclusive usage can be true when both of the elements that make it up are true, but that it is able to circulate around all of these different intensities, whether it be being Genghis Khan and what did I say before, Margaret Thatcher, and so on and so forth, or whether it be being both male and female. I can be both, or in the unconscious, one can be both their father and their child, and the son, and so on and so forth. In its transcendent illegitimate usage, we get an exclusive use of the disjunctive synthesis, where one is either male or female. This is where they have all of that rich discussion of bisexuality, in contrast to this disjunctive usage, where one is either the child or the parent. And the idea of a double bind is a sort of, well, we've all heard of double binds, right? You flip a coin, and what do you say to the other person in the double bind? Heads I win, tails you lose. That's a double bind, right? No matter what, the person can't lose, but they still have to play the game in this situation. There's no escape from it. Lacan, in his forced veil of alienation, gives a great example of a double bind, where he says, in the dialectic of alienation, your money or your life, right? And so suppose that you want to keep your money, well, then the mugger is going to take your life, in which case you'll lose your money anyway. Whereas if you give your money over to the beggar, well, that is a terrible situation as well, because if we say that money is jouissance, from one perspective, you've given up your enjoyment that makes your life worth living. It's a double bind. You can't win in this situation. Many of us have experienced the boss or the teacher that places us in double binds, where they say, look, they're like the who is the actor from Mork and Mindy? What was his name again? He committed suicide last year.
Robin Williams.
Yeah, Robin Williams, right? The kind of father figure that we find in Robin Williams can be a terrifying figure, where you have the boss or the parent, right, the person in the position of authority that says, look, my door is always open to you. I want your criticism. I want to hear what you're really thinking and everything like that. But, right, that there is a sort of invisible line that you can never quite pin down, and you never know where it is, as long as you don't criticize in this sort of way. And so you can't win in this sort of situation. You're being encouraged to be open and honest with this person and to, express criticisms when you have them. But there's always this sort of Damocles over top of you, where if you do express that criticism in the wrong way, right, they're going to open up a can of whoop ass on you. Ted, are you familiar with this figure? Yeah, and so they say one thing, but they mean another. That sort of situation. Well, the Oedipus itself is a sort of double bind. Deleuze and Guattari point this out very nicely. On the one hand, we're told that we suffer from the Oedipus, and Theodore knows a thing or two about. Did this come from discussions?
I was kidding.
Okay. All right. On the one hand, we're told that we suffer from the Oedipus, and the Oedipus is what makes us sick. And, of course, the Oedipus itself is a kind of transcendent term that's being imposed on the unconscious. On the other hand, we're told that the Oedipus is what makes us healthy. Right? So, there's no way out of the Oedipus. The only way within a certain psychoanalytic framework is to internalize the Oedipus and recognize the Oedipus, that we are castrated, subject to these prohibitions, and so on and so forth. But that was also, according to these theorists, the very thing that was making us sick in the first place. And so there's a sort of double bind of the Oedipus. And of course, the other double bind that we are confronted with respect to the Oedipus is that we're told that either you navigate the Oedipal triangle, right, and so you recognize that the mother is prohibited, that you have to either identify with the father and assume his place, or if you're the girl, become the the object of the father's desire in some way or another. Either you bow down to the Oedipus, or you fall into a chaos of undifferentiation, right? You just fall apart completely. And this is, I find, to be a very... Oh, that's interesting, Ted. Pascal's Wager, or Derrida's Pharmacon, I think, is a good example of this, sure. This is an interesting moment because let's remember what Guattari... What he does during this time period, he is, right, a clinician at Labor working with psychotics. If you know your Lacanian theory, and he was, Lacan was Guattari's analyst, and it was Guattari that brought Lacanianism to Labor. It was almost a religion, if Dosse's biography is to be believed. At Labor, they were all obsessed with mathemes and Lacanian theory. And when we talk about the schizophrenic, what are we told is the cause of the schizophrenia, the foreclosure of the name of the father, in other words, the Oedipus. And so the choice that you are given in this framework, the theory of foreclosure, in psychosis or schizophrenia, the name of the father is foreclosed. What is it that happens? The subject undergoes this kind of disintegration. They fall apart as a result of this missing Oedipal signifier in their psychic system. Well, that is the stark choice that they say we're faced with in the transcendent use of the disjunctive synthesis, the paralogism of the double bind, where you either submit to Oedipus, bow down to heteronormative gender identity, and become a subject of castration and lack, or you have a schizophrenic meltdown where you fall apart. And what they seem to be suggesting in the imminent usage of the disjunctive synthesis, there is a healthy kind of schizophrenia that is not complete undifferentiation and lack of any sort of organization. They reverse things, and they say, what makes the schizophrenic sick? And this caused a lot of controversy, right? Because people said, look, right, and if you read the clinical theory on schizophrenics, these people suffer a great deal. They are pervaded by jouissance that is unregulated. It's like, imagine the worst anxiety you've ever had. And this is the way the schizophrenic, in the midst of a psychotic break, experiences themselves. They are just pervaded by this incredibly painful jouissance. And people say, look, these people are suffering, they're a mess, and here you are romanticizing the schizophrenic. And they turn things upside down. They say, no, right? The reason that schizophrenics is a clinical entity, what we encounter in the institution, is such a mess, is precisely because the institution has tried to submit their schizophrenic process to the Oedipus, and this is what leads them. Thomas, it's called The Intersecting Lives of Deleuze and Guattari, or something like that, and so it's
I haven't checked it out yet, but I do have it. Okay.
It's pretty interesting. And there's a lot. And it sounds like Guattari to me was an absolutely horrible person, but he was quite authoritarian. And Daniel, you agree with that?
Guattari was authoritarian?
Oh yeah. I mean, he was a little dictator when he came to Labor, and.
And it's a very common anarchist dialectic, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I knew he was very arrogant, but I thought he loved freedom and like wanted to liberate people. But I guess maybe he thought he was such an expert on liberty and freedom that everyone should learn from him.
Read the biography and see what your impressions are. Jason, do you care to expand on what you said about an anarchist dialectic?
Well, I just think that I actually talked about this in my book, Occupy Time. I talked about how, there's a weird thing with, the theory of dictatorship and Carl Schmitt. One of the things that he loves about dictatorship is that there is no discussion. He has a critique of government by discussion. And I don't know, some of it seems similar to the anarchist critique of democracy, in a way. Which is that we don't need to have these everlasting discussions. What we need is for the pure the pure individual will to kind of express itself. So I think there is a weird kind of folding back from anarchism into authoritarianism when it is not when it remains insufficiently dialectical or insufficiently materialist would be a better way to put it if we're being Deleuzians.
Yeah, and I think that Deleuze and Guattari are actually very helpful here in theorizing, what you're talking about, because one of the refrains throughout this book is this concept of microfascism, and so they emphasize that various organizations and institutions can be on the left at the molar level, but there's still this Oedipal desire that animates them at the level of the micrological unconscious for this sort of authority and submission that you find in these institutions. And so I quite agree with you when you talk about this common dialectic that we find in among anarchists. Where and I don't even see it being restricted to that. I think we see it in all sorts of theories. Certainly, when I was more heavily involved with Lacanian institutions, well, here you're dealing with a body of theory that argues that the other doesn't exist and there is no other or the other, and that the father is always an imposter. And what do you find Lacan, the theoretician, being treated as? You find him being treated as a father that is not castrated, that's not limited in any way, and you begin to treat his work as some sort of holy scripture to be endlessly interpreted and commented on without being added to. You see this among Derridians and the sort of reverential position that they often put Derrida and his work in itself. There seems to be this repeated Oedipal contradiction with its authoritarian innate. Heideggerians is a great example, but it's less hypocritical in the case of Heidegger, I think, right? Because he never, claimed these things, about the nature of difference and or difference and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's something that comes up again and again. I think I lost my train of thought. Yeah, but other things about Guattari, that one story that always sticks out to me from this biography. He would purposely and get other people to do this as well. Whenever and people lived at Labor, the doctors lived there, the nurses lived there, the patients lived there. It was like a community where these people lived. And whenever couples would begin to form, they would break up the couples because they saw the very form of romantic love and attachment to a particular person as being fascist in nature.
If you find that interesting, you really have to see the film The Lobster, which is all about compulsory coupledom, but then the rebels, the anti-coupledom rebels, have compulsory singledom, and so the film proceeds through those two forms of control. And arrives at kind of a third option in which there is no compulsory anything, basically. Yeah.
I just find those sections so interesting. It's so interesting when they talk about putting the schizoanalysis to practice in these institutions. It kind of sounds like pure hell to me, the way they lived. Everybody, like at the meetings, every month they would renegotiate salaries. And the meetings consisted of people talking about their desires and their affects, and so there was all sorts of conflict, and everything was constantly shifting around. But maybe I'm just too much of an Oedipalized subject to live in these ways.
Sounds insane.
Yeah, it does. If you read the biography, I mean, sit down and read the biography, and there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of good came out of it, and everything. But a lot of it sounds like it was exhausting. Is what it came down to, and people did drift away after a time. All right, so any further? We've kind of gotten off track here, and we're running out of time. Further comments?
I would just say that at some point I'd like to discuss what. I don't know if they even give a vision of this, but I'd like to have an idea of what a schizophrenic society would be like for them. When they discuss the schizo and him building his table, and that there's no real teleological end to it or purpose to it. He's just connecting to connect. You want to ask, what kind of society could emerge if there is no sense of, I think about, coming from the Heideggerian background, so much of everything we do as Dasein is project driven, that we're trying to accomplish something. We have it might not be a straight up representation in our head, but we have some sense of something we want to accomplish, some end we're headed towards. And, if it's just about partial objects connecting to other partial objects, I get that they say that's productive, but I don't know if when you take planning, representation, care, projection out of that, what world does this create?
It's a good question. Now they are careful to say when they talk about these connective syntheses in the schizophrenic process. They are careful to say that that the process isn't the goal itself. And they say that when the continuation of that process is treated as a goal in itself, this becomes problematic for the schizophrenic subject. But they're not quite clear on what they have in mind as the alternative to that. And maybe when we get to chapter 4, we'll get a little bit more clarity on that that issue. All right, so that's about all we have time for this evening. One of the things that I do want to emphasize but again, in this, Ted, it's good that you bring this up, because this is exactly where I was going next. you had mentioned earlier in the class, I can't remember if it was before the break or after the break, that the unconscious is inherently social. And so it is already immediately plugged into all sorts of relationships with the outside world. It's not a solitary or a lonely affair. And we saw a little bit of this in the Kafka book as well, where this sort of minor literature that he's developing is, social in nature. And so, a big part of what they're up to here, and I think that they're right on these points, a big part of what they're up to here is to emphasize that desire and the unconscious are not private individual affairs of the family, that they're already plugged into this entire broad world outside of the family setting. And so, of course, that's going to carry the implication that desire is political in nature. It's not a private affair, which is going to raise all sorts of issues. That also means that the maladies that we suffer from aren't simply a matter of the family that we were brought up in and those personal experiences, right? These things that we suffer from, if there is a place for suffering in schizoanalysis, are results of the entire social field. The things that go on, they move and they flow throughout all of us. And reverberate in our unconscious. And so one of the things that, and it's difficult to know, is this what the third paralogism is about? Paralogism of application, or is this what the fifth paralogism is about? They seem to be very similar to me in some ways. But there is this discussion that comes up again and again about Judge Schraber. And it's really true of any analysan that you might encounter in the clinic, but we'll stick to Judge Schraber. When you read Freud's case study of Judge Schraber, Freud just talks about how Schraber suffered from a homoerotic desire, and this was related to his relationship to his father. His father was a pretty awful person. He was an education reformer that wrote all sorts of things on how children should be reared, and it sounds like the upbringing that Schraber had was absolutely terrible. He was forced to wear these bizarre devices that presided over posture and prevented him from touching himself in inappropriate ways. And I mean, it was just insane the way this kid was, this poor child was tortured. But Freud just talks about how everything that appears in Schraber's delusion, God, the doctor that he's dealing with, and the birds and so on, are expressions of his relationship with his father. And when you go and read Schraber's actual book, through which he healed himself, the more he elaborated and developed his delusion, the more he wrote it down, the more functional and stable he became as an individual. It's an interesting thing about psychosis. In many instances, when you're treating a psychotic or a schizophrenic, you don't try to disabuse them of their delusion. You help them and assist them in developing their delusion, and they gain greater stability as a result of this. Well, when you read Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, and it's a fascinating book, in many respects resembles Spinoza's Ethics, I think. But when you read this book, it is filled with, just as Deleuze and Guattari say, this rich material that pertains to races, to history, to politics, to events that have taken place. And all of that is erased within the Freudian framework. All of this social and political dimension of the unconscious And you encounter this across the board when, whether you're dealing with schizophrenics, there's religion involved, there's myth involved, there are political issues involved, conflicts between nations, racial identities, and all these sorts of things. And when you deal with analysis with neurotics, you find the same sort of material. But what's taking place in either the third paralogism of application, am I getting them right? Or the fifth paralogism of desiring production or afterward, it's difficult for me to distinguish these two, is this reduction of all that rich material that desire is clearly grappling with and tracing it all back to the family network. And so, one of the points I think that they make that's really nice in this chapter is the way in which, while clearly the parents and the siblings are going to be a part of the subject's desiring relations, the desire is already and always overflowing this Oedipal triangle. And they at one point they make the gorgeous point that while children obviously play at being mummy and daddy and so on and so forth, that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. They're always playing at being a businessman or fireman or a cowboy or ninjas, a mermaid or whatever. They're experimenting with all of these social roles, and they're more than aware that their family is lodged in this broader social network that echoes the Dreyfus affair and Daddy's Boss and anarchist politics and all of these sorts of things. Desire is feeding out into all these things, and so they have this paradoxical image of an open triangle, that the triangle, the Oedipus, is always open onto this broader social world that desire is, and I'm sure Jason, given his life, could speak to some of this. Jason, it sounds like you've led a very interesting life in childhood. But
you mean like the fact that I have like 23 grandparents or whatever?
Yeah, and just the way you moved around and so.
Oh yeah, I moved around a lot, but I also came from a divorced family, and both of my parents remarried twice, so I had like 3 sets of parents and 12 sets of grandparents or something like that. So wow. I mean that's part of why psychoanalysis didn't fully resonate with me, and I really liked Reich because I thought of him as sort of being anti-Freudian, and I've never completely been able to get all the way into Anti-Oedipus, so I'm really enjoying sort of like listening somewhat passively right now, and eventually I plan to go back and really grapple with it. But
yeah, I always have such ambivalent feelings about it. I'm never sure where I come down on it. But certainly this idea of this, that the conflicts subjects are encountering are just about this family drama, this internal family drama, that mama didn't love me enough, or or my father didn't recognize me enough, or I want to kill my father, or something like that. They're saying that the unconscious is much broader than all of that. When people were so excited by Bernie Sanders, or when they're excited by Trump right now, it's not because Trump is an expression of their father that they yearn for, or that Sanders was an expression of their father, or that Clinton is an expression of their mother, or something like that. There's a real libidinal investment in social and political issues that goes beyond that family network that we suffer from, and that we also find our joy in. And so I think that's a good place to stop for today. I guess we did make it through the 2.5 hours, so I'm pleased by that. I think a good discussion today. And so we'll pick up here next time, quickly go through those, and then we're going to begin to get into the really exciting material, I think, with the socius and the different mechanisms by which the socius produces this repression, and the possibilities that are behind these different social formations as well.
Levi, can I ask you just real quick? since I'm not sure on the schedules, are we just going to go ahead and read the first 9 chapters of part 3 for next week?
Yeah, I mean, we can do it that way. We'll get as far as we can. It's over 100 pages, and so there's just no way, next week we could get through over 100 pages of material. So we'll do the best that we can.
Okay.
So I hope I see all of you next week. Were there any other questions or remarks before we called it a night?
I was just gonna say, in terms of sort of the Oedipal triangle and like things going back to mothers and fathers, I feel like there are for some people, their psychological life really does go back to, largely to parental relationships. But for many people, it doesn't. I really think it's sort of, it's not that model has no validity. I just don't think it's sort of universally applicable.
Yeah, and I mean, they're cognizant, like they say explicitly, like, patients come in there and they talk about their parents. They do say something that I found deeply offensive at one point. My hair is put on end. Here, let me just mute you here because we're getting some reverb. But they say, look, your Oedipus is a drag, and if you keep talking about your Oedipus, we're going to give you shock treatment or kick you out of therapy. And you're like, holy fuck, right? Again, I'm being recorded, right? Seriously, just tell them to shut up, and maybe they had some sort of horribly abusive parent or something like that, or grew up in these terrible circumstances, and that's what they need to talk about. It seems like a very cruel thing to say, but I also do get the sense that when you think about a schizoanalytic therapy and what they were trying to do in places like the Labor, that where in a psychoanalytic approach, in a psychoanalytic approach, you spend a lot of time talking and analyzing and remembering and working through and all these things that you do in psychoanalysis, whereas in a schizoanalytic approach, you do things, right? And so, a big thing that that they found with some of their schizophrenic patients and their patients that were suffering was that, say that you gave this schizophrenic patient who was barely talking, they were borderline, catatonic, and all of these sorts of things, or they were in the grips of a horrible delusion and they were self-punishing, they were wiping shit on the walls. When you read the stories about some of these more radical clinics where the doctors and nurses lived with the patients, they wake up in the middle of the night and things would be set on fire and there'd be shit rubbed on the walls and, people just walking around masturbating. It was a big burden on the doctors that were involved in this anti-psychiatry movement and these sorts of things. But there was also a lot of discoveries here that took place. And with some of these patients, when they were given responsibilities, right, say that you took the schizophrenic and you made them Secretary of Treasury at the institution or something like that, there was dramatic changes that took place where the patient would stabilize, and this is what a deterritorialization in a line of flight is, right? They would begin to stabilize, their delusion would get under control and everything. And, this is the idea. There's a wonderful passage in Difference and Repetition where Deleuze says, look, when you learn how to swim, what are you doing? You are synthesizing the singular points of your body. Think about how your muscle movements move and everything like that with the singular points of a wave. And something new comes into existence, a sort of transcendental aesthetic that leads to a new capacity. Well, the idea is that if we do things, if we engage with things, whether it be learning how to play an instrument or becoming the treasurer at this institution or something, that this can function as a line of flight that might allow us to get away from our neurotic symptom or, the invasive, painful jouissance in the case of a schizophrenia that is invading the subject. And so, we talked about the analyst. Say the patient is suffering from irrational thoughts like the rat man. Every time he thought about the woman that he was attracted to, he would immediately get the thought that thinking about this woman is going to lead his father to die. right? So that's irrational enough right there, right? You know, if I think about this woman or if I masturbate, my father's going to die. But here's the real kicker. His father was already dead. And so he's suffering from this obsessional thought that he just can't get out of his head. And, you know, I'm sure the Rat Man was a good Spinozist and wanted to use rationality to try and you know, solve this problem. He understood that the thought was irrational, that his dad is already dead, and that there's no logical connection between thinking about this woman and his father dying. But it is a compulsive thought. Try as he might, he can't get that connection out of his head that he's suffering from, and he's experiencing a great deal of turmoil from this. In a psychoanalytic setting, you would do a lot of free association, talking about this symptom, trying to figure out what this idea is ultimately really about. You're doing a kind of archaeology where you dig up that idea, and you know, once that is recollected or reconstructed, the symptom disappears, and it really does work. In the case of many symptoms, that once they're articulated, the compulsion or the conversion symptom disappears. It's an amazing thing. In a schizoanalytic approach, you might not spend all your time free associating about these things. You might take up some sort of new practice or activity that deterritorializes you from a territoriality, that constructs a line of flight where a new sort of subject can come into being. Two very different approaches here. Now, I'm unclear just how far Guattari would push this. If you read his notebooks, I think they're called the schizoanalytic notebooks, the Anti-Oedipus papers, there's a lot of writing that he does in there where he's essentially engaging in the process of free association and deciphering all of these things in his dreams and his thought process, which is very close to classical psychoanalysis, whereas when you read the descriptions of Labor, it seems to be this more practice-oriented sort of approach that is that's going on here. Let's say, what do we have here with Jason? Yeah, and
Yeah, I'm not saying that's an accurate description. I'm just, you know, and I realize Anti-Oedipus is partially responding precisely to that type of question.
yeah. And I mean, within a Lacanian framework, this is precisely why the distinction is made between the symbolic and the imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you're saying, you know, you can have a mother who is the breadwinner, and so basically, she's occupying the paternal place in the structure, perhaps.
Right.
Right. And so all of those things can be inverted. All that matters is the various structures of relations between these sorts of signifiers. But you know, I mean, again, I think that you know, it's always the thing that comes up. You know, maybe you agree with me, Jason. I always feel like the problem with evolutionary psychologists and sociologists, they might be onto something to a certain degree, but their whole problem is they've never been trained in anthropology. And so they end up generalizing the Western, because they all come from this background and they're male predominantly, they end up treating Oedipal structure or the nuclear family as a cultural universal, and anybody who spent any time, I think this is what you're alluding to here with Hawaii, anybody who spent any time with anthropology knows that there are an incredible variety of different kinship structures that are organized in different ways, and we can't, you know, make these sorts of assumptions. My favorite is the Na of the Chinese highlands, where there are no fathers and mothers at all. Yeah, because there's no marital bond, and the children are raised collectively.
And in the Punaluan family, specifically, it's usually a woman who has a number of male suitors, and it's never clear who the father is, but
Yeah.
all of her suitors are equally required to play some sort of parental role. But in a way, it's like the woman is kind of in a sort of phallic position.
Yeah, and I mean, interestingly enough, in his earliest work, Lacan was cognizant of all of this. He thinks that something catastrophic happens in the shift to the nuclear family within Western culture and other cultures that practice this. And so in his earliest work, he talks about totemism a good deal, which the totem of the tribe functions as the name of the father, and the maternal uncle plays the role at the level of the imaginary as the divider. And because the name of the father and the paternal figure aren't in the same place, it's a much easier structure for subjects to navigate in their development, and we don't get the neurotic structures, he contends, in these structures. And one of the problems that arises within Western culture, at least as it was in Freud's time and throughout much of the last century, is the imaginary father and the symbolic father are both occupying the same position and function, which gives rise to the possibility of all sorts of psychic conflicts as the person tries to navigate that structure. And clearly, you know, what we're seeing right now is that while for a long time you could make these assumptions about your patients when they came into your office, if you're in France or the United States, that they probably came from this kind of a kinship structure, and there would be certain deadlocks to that. It's just no longer possible to make those assumptions in Europe and in the United States and you know, other places around the world, where this kind of family structure is increasingly, it's no longer there, right? You know, it's no longer the nuclear family where the woman is the caregiver and the father does this. And you know, we have divorced families now. We have same-sex families. We have people raising children alone. All of these sorts of things that are they're going to have different structures, and so you need to have some sort of ethnographic consciousness to think about these things in terms of the unconscious in I think responsible ways. Mm-hmm. Did I make any sense there at all?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. But I tend to be a pretty far left Lacanian. There's a lot of the stuff I just don't buy into that you'll hear these people talking about. You know, certainly I would not have the sorts of issues that Zizek recently had in his discussion of transsexuality. My God.
Yeah. Well, and then there's also the Daniel W. Smith, who claims that the late Lacan is a Deleuzian Lacan.
Yeah, I think that's right. He was.
I was just asking. So you agree with that?
I do. I think that. I think that Lacan, while he was very angry with the publication of Anti-Oedipus, I think he did take it to heart and revised a number of things. And the final Lacan is what I would like to teach in a seminar here at some point. And it's incredibly difficult. But I do think he calls into a question a lot of early assumptions he had made about these things in a way that becomes much more flexible and far less Oedipal. And so there is, and this is the stuff that Genevieve is working on as well. Who I need to actually sit down and talk to at a certain point. I promised her I would do that, and I haven't been able to find the time to do it. All right, so that's enough for this evening. Great meeting today. Let's see if we can make similar headway next week with the socius and the mechanisms by which this stuff. Oh, come on, Ted. Freud's better than that, right? But I mean, really, he is undoing the father, right? This is the guy that unlocked the unconscious, and you know, as they say explicitly, psychoanalysis created the way beyond the Oedipus. Freud himself brought this into effect. Question is, say, lose their resolve. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was only quoting that the passage where they say Freud never managed to escape the world of the father or of guilt.
Yeah.
In 81. Anyway.
So let's see if we can make similar headway next week with Chapter 4 and figure out what these mechanisms are by which this Oedipalization takes place and gets imposed upon us. All right, so I look forward to seeing all you next week.
Thanks, Levi. Thanks, everybody. Great talk.
Thanks, Levi.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good night.